Welcome back to the Discover podcast, where we view faith as a discovery journey with Jesus to help you become the person God created you to be. Hey there, Meadowbrook Church. Welcome to this first episode of the Discover podcast. In this episode, I get to sit in the interviewee seat with my good friend Nate Gruber as we talk about my faith development and my call to ministry and how God used different, unique circumstances to call me to be a pastor and some of what he's teaching me today.
Welcome, Meadowbrook folks. We are beginning a podcast called the Discover Podcast. We are starting a new initiative here at Meadowbrook, which some of you are familiar with, and I think if you're not, you're going to find out about it, but it's called Storytellers. It comes from Psalm 107, which says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story." And so we thought, what better way to do that than to start a podcast and hear some stories?
Yep.
We thought, who better than Bryan Marvel to kick us off with that?
There's probably a lot of people who are better than Bryan Marvel.
There could be several. Yeah, there could be several.
But by default,
yeah,
I'm number one.
Yes, you're number one. So we're glad to have you here to share a little bit about your story, because I think a lot of people know you, but might not actually really know you all that well. And so hearing your story for kind of a half an hour or so, I think will just be a really good experience.
It'll be riveting.
So, yes.
Riveting.
Yes. So, why don't we get into a little bit of that story?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. So, when we think of a story has several parts, right? Mm-hmm. A beginning, a middle, and end. There's a main character.
Yep.
Probably has to face some sort of conflict as well. And so just kind of set the frame for us and give us a little bit of a snapshot of what your story started out with and how your faith in Jesus really began.
Yeah. So with these stories, what we're really looking at is stories of faith and the journey of faith that people have been on. And mine started probably when I was about 6 or 7 years old. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I would have been kindergarten, first grade, maybe second grade. And we lived in Kansas at the time. We lived in Wichita, Kansas. Shout out to Monty, Kansas folks. Yeah. And so I grew up a church kid. Always being a part of a church as far back as I can remember. And one of my earliest memories of being in church was walking into church one Sunday. We had a pretty traditional looking sanctuary, kind of like ours, a high vaulted ceiling, center aisle, pews, ugly red carpet from the 80s. This was the 80s at the time.
Okay.
And as I'm walking down the center aisle, what I see at the front of the church is this long, narrow table with stacks and stacks of silver plates. Mm-hmm. And in my 6 or 7 year old mind, what that meant that day was that it was snack day in church. Somewhere along the way, in the middle of the service, the pastor was going to stand up. He was going to call these guys up front, and then he was just going to start passing around these silver trays, and people are going to take a snack, And so I thought that was very interesting, very intriguing. But my parents would never let us take communion. When we were younger, because they wanted to ensure that we understood the meaning of it, and they wanted to ensure that we really knew what we were doing. So we walk into church this one day, and I see these silver plates up front, and I think again in my 6 or 7 year old mind, I'm going to do whatever it takes today to take snack in church. And so we're sitting in like one of the first pews, and I'm sitting next to my dad, and I'm just like asking all these questions about it, about what it means, why they won't let us take it, and what it's for. And somewhere along the way, my dad explains the death of Jesus to me and how his death takes care of our sins, how his death launches and his resurrection launches new creation in the world. And I'm like, great, what does that mean for me? And he's like, well, you have to say this prayer and ask Jesus into your heart. And I'm thinking again in my 6 or 7 year old mind, like that's it?
Wow.
That's all I have to do. I have to say a prayer and then I can take snack. And so sure enough, that day I said, I will pray whatever prayer you asked me to pray to take snack in church. And so I did. And my motive was completely skewed, right? Yeah. But I do believe that somehow in that moment, like God started a work in me. So one of my favorite verses is Philippians 1:6, where Paul writes, "He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion on the day of Christ Jesus." And I look at my own story thinking, even though my motives were completely skewed as a 6 or 7 year old kid, that Jesus met me there in that church pew, taking communion, praying with my dad, and he started something in my life that has led me to where I am today that will carry me on until the day he returns.
That's awesome. And it's a pretty cool highlight because I think it's pretty normal that when each of us looks back at our own stories, I think a lot of times it's skewed, right? Like where our motives are not totally right on. Like we don't get all the theology behind what we're even doing. But so it's kind of cool that you're able to look back at that and see like God started something there. Now, obviously he didn't end there. He kept on doing things throughout your childhood. So I'm just wondering if there's a couple things that mark the way along the way. Maybe it's in school growing up or as you went off to college. And if you could just share a couple of those markers of like, here's something big that God did along the way.
Yeah. So one of the realities of my childhood was moving around a lot. Some of you have heard me say that. So I think it was like 6 moves before I was 13 years old. So here's just a quick recap of all the places. It was Kansas. I was born in Colorado. Then it was Kansas, Texas, back to Colorado, Arizona, and then New Hampshire.
Wow.
So we moved to New Hampshire when I was in 7th grade. And so, those first few moves, you're young enough that you don't really know any better. But by the time we moved from Colorado to Arizona, I was going into 6th grade. We were in Arizona only a year. And I thought Arizona was like the place to be because it was summer year round. And as a 6th grader, I was like, I'm outside all the time, hanging out with my friends, rollerblading. That was cool at that time. Rollerblades were becoming a thing. Like it was just like we were outside all year round. And so when we moved from Arizona to New Hampshire, right, from the southeast or southwest to the northeast, I mean, a massive move for a kid going into 7th grade. When my parents told us we were moving, like, I'll never forget, I cried, like I bawled, like I wept that I have to leave this place and go to where? New Hampshire? Like, where is that? Like, I had to actually pull out a map and like find where this place was. Now, in hindsight, like that was an amazing move. Like there were so many things that were afforded to me in that move that would not have happened otherwise. But I was so aware of, like, I'm in middle school, I'm moving across the country, I'm going to this place, and I have 0 friends. And so for like middle school and high school, trying to figure out friends it wasn't a huge challenge for me, but it was something that was very much front and center. I played sports, which was an easy way to make friends, but I also, and fortunately we had a church where there was an active youth group, and so I was able to make friends there. But what I started to find in my life was kind of this duality of, like, I have church friends and I have school friends, and I used to act one way around church friends and a completely different way around school and sport friends. And it was trying to figure out who am I in between these two worlds. And I'll never forget the youth group that I was a part of did this initiative, participated in what was a national initiative called See You at the Pole, where it's usually in September. Like, youth groups across the country will encourage and challenge their students to go to the flagpole on the school's campus and start the day through prayer. Some schools do a pretty significant job or do a pretty big job of, like, making it a big moment for their youth group and for the school. So I'll never forget, I was in high school. I probably would have been a freshman or a sophomore. My brother, who is a couple years older than I was, junior, senior. And where my locker was on the front hallway of the school, overlooking the courtyard where the flagpole was. And I'll never forget that day, my entire youth group met out at that flagpole. And I was at my locker hanging out with my friends, like watching them go to the pole, watching them pray. My brother walks up and everybody notices, hey, there's your brother praying, making fun of him and kind of making fun of me just for being his brother. But at the same time recognizing that, like, hey, I'm not out there with him praying, but hey, that's your brother. Isn't that kind of funny? Isn't that kind of weird? And that left a real mark on me to say, like, oh, who do I want to be? Now, like, within the social landscape of our school, I was on the cooler side because I played sports. My older brother was on the not so cool side, the nerdy side.
Sure.
But I had tons of respect for him in that moment for standing up for what he believed, knowing that it would cost him when I was a coward and, like, held back with my friends instead. So then when I transitioned to college, that became a huge moment for me, again, to say, hey, you've got a fresh start. And who are you going to be? Like, are you going to be somebody who just goes along with the crowd and does whatever? or are you going to follow what God might have for you?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I never knew that story. It's a really cool story. I think so often, especially as adults, we just forget. We think of ourselves as we kind of know who we are for the most part. And it's easy to forget that there were times in our lives where it really was as simple as like a decision. Like, am I going outside today or am I staying inside? Which is like crazy, but those are like two very different paths.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to kind of see how that was developing. Now, obviously, you talked about college just a little bit. Like, you're heading into college, you have an opportunity to really decide who you're going to be. I wonder just what that next step looked like, and somewhere along the way here, you're a pastor now. Like, you got some sort of a call to ministry, and so I'd just love to hear a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So when I went to college, went to a state school in New Hampshire, about 2 hours away from where I grew up, and I knew within that first semester that I probably need to find Christian friends. But it took me a better part of that first semester to actually take the step and go to our campus ministry. And so it was beginning second semester when I was like, okay, I need to do this. I went and got plugged into our campus ministry. And within the first few months of being involved, they started talking about this campus-wide outreach program that they were going to do called the I Agree With program. And so it's a real simple strategy that takes 2 weeks, and you kind of like plaster the campus with this phrase, I agree with, and then you insert somebody's name. So it'd be like, I agree with Nate. Okay. So you just have signs all over school that say, I agree with Nate.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Everybody around here agrees with Nate all the time. So it just raises the question, like, who's Nate?
Yeah.
And who are these people who agree with him, and what do they agree with him about, right? So it's just intended to provoke curiosity. And then the second week of that kind of campus outreach, people will wear shirts that say, I agree with Nate. So that answers the question like, oh, these are the people who agree with Nate.
Okay.
But it still leaves two more questions, like, who's Nate? And what do they agree with him about?
Yeah.
So at the end of that second week, the person whose name is on the signs and the shirts writes a little statement of faith, publishes it in the school paper, and then pretty much invites the whole campus. If you want to learn more about what this person believes, come to this place at this time and hear their story.
Cool.
So our campus director came to me and said, hey, we would like for you to be this person.
Oh, wow.
Who would be the focal point of this outreach program.
You were a freshman at this time?
I was a freshman.
Wow.
So this person like pulled me into their office, told me that they wanted to do this. And then what I told them was like, I'll go pray about it.
Sure.
And I had no intention of saying yes. I'll pray about it. Pretty sure I'm going to say no. Thanks for the invite. That's really kind of you.
Yeah.
And I went on my way. Now, at that same time, I was working at a Christian camp on the weekends, like running games for kids, playing on their worship team, washing dishes, whatever they needed to do. And one session, it was like that Saturday night session. It was the sermon of the youth speaker was over. The worship team was closing out the service with a few songs. I was in the back of the room, just kind of like observing it all, soaking it all in. And it was as clear as day. It was like the Lord was all over me in that moment. And he said, Bryan, like, this is what I have for you. I'm inviting you into this moment. You're wondering what it means to follow me. You've wanted a fresh start at college to really make the decision to follow me. And here's a great moment to do that. Will you step into this and trust that I have something for you? And I remember thinking, like, I have to do this. I have to go to my campus minister and tell them that I will be the person who has their name plastered all over campus.
Wow.
And I didn't want that because I didn't want to be labeled as preacher boy, the guy who talked about Jesus or whatever and had his name plastered all over the school and published a statement of faith. Like, I didn't want to be known for that.
Wow.
But God was inviting me into that. And I felt like I need to take this step of faith, do it, and see what happens. So the day comes where, like, okay, I had friends who saw the signs all over campus for a week, saw T-shirts, had no idea it was me. Like, I didn't say that it was me. But I would hear them talking about it and stuff. And then we knew that on our college campus, if we were to invite people to come to some room on an evening, middle of the week, some corner classroom of the campus, nobody would show.
Okay.
So we placed our event middle of the student center, middle of the campus, middle of the day on a Wednesday.
Sure.
At noon,
Sure.
knowing that if people aren't going to necessarily go seek this out, we're going to bring it to them.
Yeah.
And people who are walking by and recognize me, at the very least, will stop and listen. And that's what happened. I mean, we had probably 80 people. I'll never forget, like there was a fireplace in this like little courtyard with seats, we had set up. And then there was like this stairway that went up with like a balcony that looked down on it. And the whole stairway and the balcony was full of people listening. And there was like 50 people sitting in front of me, people walking by the corridor, the hallway right next to us. And it was this very like electric moment for me, where when it was, I was scared to death to do it. But when it was all said and done, I found myself saying, if I could do that for a living, I would. Wow. Not really knowing what that was, but there was something there for me in that moment that I felt like lined up with who I was as a person and how I was gifted and how I was wired, that God had something for me in that. And so that would, in my mind, I would say that was the beginning of my call to ministry when I was a freshman in college. And I initially didn't want to do it, but I did.
Yeah, which is so common, right? I mean, even as we read scripture, you get these biblical characters who get this call. I don't know how many of them are excited about the call.
Right.
And I think if you are overly excited at first, that should be a little bit of a red flag on some levels, that you might be interested in something more than what God wants to do. So
you think of the prophets who are like, please ask anybody else. Yeah. Please, anybody but me.
Yeah, this is not a lifestyle choice that most people want. Right. It just strikes me, you share the story from high school, you have this attitude of like, really being quiet about your faith and avoiding and seeing your brother actually doing something, and you're kind of sitting on the sidelines while your friends are making fun of him. And then you look at this story, and now all of a sudden you're the one out in front of like the whole campus, right? Yeah. I know not everyone was there, but it's like quite a dichotomy. Like these are two completely different versions of Bryan.
Yeah.
Like God is like changing Bryan over the course of these couple of years, which is pretty cool. So this happens in college. Obviously, this is a really significant moment. And then as you exit college, I mean, at some point you entered into formal ministry. And I know that you've worked in a couple of churches. And I just wonder if there's any stories from maybe one of those where you kind of look at and you say, there's some other really significant things that happened as I started work in formal ministry.
Yeah, so the quick flyby, I was finishing college, going to seminary, met Becky there and got married. And then we moved to Atlanta, which was a huge surprise to us because Becky being from Wisconsin, me being from New Hampshire, I was pretty sure we were going to end up somewhere up north in between Wisconsin and New Hampshire. That just made sense to me. And in my final year of school, I put a resume in with the placement office and was getting a lot of interest from churches in Ohio, New
This is
York.
after seminary.
Yeah, like my final semester, because churches know that, hey, this school is turning out graduates, so hey, let's go see if we can find some staff members to fill some spots. So I probably had my last semester of school, I had weekly conversations with churches about ministry opportunities. And out of the blue, this guy from Atlanta shows up on campus. He's looking to interview people. He got my resume from the placement office. We went and sat down for Becky and I were married at that time, had a quick conversation with him on campus. I think met him at a TGI Fridays that night. Like I actually skipped a class just to go talk to him. And then it's like, hey, you should come visit. And I mean, it just happened so fast from, meeting this guy in May to moving there in September. It was like every other week there was another thing that was happening. And so we're like, we're going to Atlanta, you know? And our time in Atlanta was a phenomenal time, but like a wildly messy time. Okay. Like the church was highly dysfunctional, lots of like conflict. We went through a church split. There was like 2 or 3 pastors that served, each leaving not great, elder board intention, like all over the place. It was like from one year to the next, just another level of mess and dysfunction. And in that, I remember thinking like, if I ever get a chance to lead a church, like health is going to be my top priority. We will be healthy before we are anything else, because I saw firsthand and lived firsthand that a health of a church really sets the course for the trajectory of the effectiveness of its ministry. You will only be as effective as you are healthy. And so God just taught me so many things. I'm not a depressed, I don't struggle with depression. I'm not like, I'm a pretty optimistic, positive, but I remember there were days that I could barely get out of bed to go to the office because it was so hard to be there. And the Lord just shaped me a ton through that season, even though it was really, really hard.
So thanks for sharing that. I think about these moments. We use the language Kairos moments, which is actually a term that you taught me a few years ago. And we've been talking about it through storytellers. And I think if people haven't heard it yet, they're going to hear it soon as well. It's going to be one of those terms that pops up throughout the series here.
And the way that we define a Kairos moment is simply like the kingdom breaking into your life, God's activity in your life, an invitation from God to follow him, to step out in faith. It's just God at work and us responding.
And so I think some of the stories you've told, as I'm listening, I'm thinking, okay, these are like these kind of big Kairos moments where it's pretty obvious looking back, like, oh yeah, God was doing something there. Oh yeah, God did something big there. God called me that night at the worship service, when I was and that's really, really cool. And I think for a lot of us, and those of us listening, it's like we can think back in our own life. Some of us know the date of like when we became a Christian. It was like at 2:15 in the afternoon on this particular day, like God spoke to me. That's really cool. I guess what I'm wondering is, now you're a pastor, you've been doing this for a long time. My guess is you probably experience less of those types of moments, but you probably experience much smaller, more consistent moments, or maybe I'm just projecting, but I'd love to hear a little bit about that. Is, how do you experience God in your life today, or what are some of those Kairos moments that you experience today?
So when we lived in Atlanta is where I came across this tool, the Kairos tool, came across the term Kairos moments, and it just kind of made my understanding of discipleship come alive at a new level. Because before that, my perception of discipleship was I have to go learn all of this information. I have to become really smart and know the Bible. And then I'm supposed to like tell people what it means. But how that changed my perspective was, well, it's less about what you know, and it's about your faithfulness, your obedience, and your willingness to follow. And so the assumption of the tool and the assumption of like the friends of mine and the people I was engaged with at that time said you can boil discipleship down to two things, two questions. What is God doing? And how are you supposed to respond? And for me, that was like revolutionary. I mean, as a guy who had this seminary degree, who could kind of work with the Greek and Hebrew, and I was like, wow, like this changes the game in terms of discipleship. Really is that simple. What is God doing in my life? How is he inviting me? And am I responding to it? And so, what I am most interested in, I love hearing those stories about how people came to faith, how God moved them from one season to the next, because there's really cool moments of stories where God is at work. But I'm even more interested and more curious about those everyday moments, because I feel like that's where the contours of our faith and the textures of our faith really come alive. And so earlier for me, this fall, I had a moment where there's a school in our neighborhood. It's called Kingdom Prep. It's a Lutheran school, an all-boys school, a lot of inner city kids attending this school. And I remember seeing it pop up literally across the street from our girls' school in the Catholic church on 76th Street. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that's about. Then I just started to notice the school more. And kept thinking like, oh, I wonder what's going on there. And I would see kids at Center Street Park from the school having football practice or soccer practice. And then we started having some individuals from our church work there and volunteer there. And so I was like, you know what, I should go. And I know that you had met the headmaster, the principal there, Kevin, and some other people had met him. And I just hadn't had a chance to meet Kevin. And so I reached out to him last spring. We set up tried to connect, but it just didn't work out. So going into this school year, I was like, I really need to go meet this guy.
Yeah.
So I sent him an email. We set up a time to meet. He toured the school with me, showed me everything, told me the story of the school. And I just found myself thinking like, this is a good place to be involved. It's literally right in my backyard. Like the inner city has come to my neighborhood.
Yeah.
Like, what am I supposed to do with that? But at the same time, I was like, but I have zero time. Like I'm already overextended. I don't have more capacity for relationships. Like I just don't have any more margin to give.
Yeah.
But also at the same time felt like, but there's something here I need to pay attention to. So later that afternoon, I'm just driving, doing errands, driving in my car, just thinking about that. And what came to mind was like one of the ways that Jesus connected with people was having meals with people.
Yep.
Part of my regular weekly rhythm is to have meals with people for lunch or coffee or whatever. It's like a normal part of how I connect with people.
I thought you were going to say it's eating.
Yeah.
That you eat, which same. I do too.
Or a normal part of my weekly rhythm is I eat food.
Okay.
You eat food, I eat food.
Good.
And so I was like, maybe what I should do is take 2 meal slots a month
Yeah.
and give them to the school and just show up and just say, hey, I'll be here for lunch and see what happens. So I've done that 2 or 3 times now. And it's wildly exciting. Like I'm sitting with these students, just hearing their stories, getting to know their names, watching their interactions and dynamics, learning the culture of the school. And it was though, I really do feel like that was a Kairos moment where the kingdom broke into my life, gave clarity of like one simple step. And right now I'm stepping into it. I have no idea if anything will come of it. I don't know if I'll change a kid's life. You know, what might actually happen is these kids change my life more than I change theirs.
Right.
But I'm just trying to be present to what I think God invited me into in a really ordinary, mundane moment of my life. And to some extent, I'm kind of like embarrassed to say it took 6 years of watching the existence of the school in my neighborhood before I actually took the step to reach out and just get to know what's going on there.
Yeah.
But now that I'm curious to see where it will go.
Yeah. So it's a great way to just be aware of what God is doing. It's simple. It's not complicated. I think one thing I've noticed, especially just in the last 2 or 3 years, as you've taught me about noticing Kairos moments and what God might be up to, is that a lot of it is just making yourself available. I think it's easy to eat lunch in your office, right? And like you can easily just be like, I don't have time for what I already have on my plate, so I'm not going to waste an hour and go do this kind of thing.
Yeah, and being the productive junkie that I am, the productivity junkie that I am, like I want to get stuff done, and I'm getting nothing done. When I go, I'm just there, and I'm present, and I'm, so it's really easy to convince yourself that the productivity is the holy work. It's the more important work, when really it's just being present with people is sometimes the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that story. I guess I'm wondering if there's just maybe any others that you want to share before we kind of wrap up our time, because I think they are helpful for people, because I think people, I mean, most of us, we just go about our day and it's pretty routine, and like we have seasons, but things kind of just, you can get into a rut. It's really easy to miss out on what God is doing. So I don't know if you just have 1 or 2 others that you might want to share before we wrap up. Yeah.
So one of them I shared in the Kairos video, like explaining the Kairos tool and explaining Kairos moments, was again earlier this fall. I was looking up a church for, I can't even remember why. Like I often hear the name of a church, I hear the name of a pastor, and I just like naturally Google them to learn a little bit about them.
Right.
And as I did that, I found myself like slipping into the comparison game. I think for a long, long time, I've struggled with comparing myself to other people. I don't know if other people naturally do it. I naturally do it and think to myself, like, if I can compare myself to them and convince myself I'm better than them, then I can get validation from that. And so I just started to slip into that as I was looking up this church. And again, it was like hearing the audible voice of God. Hey, what if instead of comparing yourself, you prayed for these people?
Yeah.
Like, and I can remember all the way back, again in Atlanta, I was at a I was at a lunch meeting. I was on my phone, just scrolling through Facebook, sitting at this table, waiting for the person I was meeting to join me. And I found that there was this guy from seminary who posted this thing on Facebook that he was speaking at this conference, and that at this conference, also speaking alongside this guy who I went to school with, was Francis Chan, Francis Chan. And I remember thinking, like, how does he get the opportunity to speak at a conference alongside Francis Chan?
Sure.
And just found this whole swell of emotion, insecurity, comparison, anger, thinking like, I deserve that. That should be mine. And it's one of those things, like, that was, I don't know, like 10, 12 years ago. I remember it as clear as day.
Sure.
And just thinking, like, that hasn't left me. So there are these moments in our life that are like reoccurring themes or reoccurring patterns of reoccurring disruptors in our life that I think is, if we pay attention to it, could see it's something that God wants to refine in us if we're willing to move towards him in it. And so in that moment where I'm Googling a church to just learn a little bit about it, and comparison starts to overwhelm my soul, like to have a little moment to just like step back. Hey, I'm just going to pray for this church because we're on the same team after the same mission of making disciples and glorifying Jesus. Like, I should be glad for what's happening there, not feeling any other way, feeling threatened by it. So, yeah.
I think it's so helpful. I mean, gosh, that's a good one, because I think it's pretty normal. You know, if we're in a job, or even it's easy to compare, you know, even our lifestyle to other people. So I think it's just something that people struggle with a lot. Thanks for sharing that. I think as we go through storytellers, I think there might be a temptation for us as we see our life as a story to want to know what the end is and to want it to be a good, happy story. But as you know, because you know so many of the people in our church and just life in general, life is messy and it's hard, and we're in the middle of it, and we can't see beginning from end in the way that God does. And so I think just hearing these little things along the way where it's obvious that the Bryan from high school or from college that was mentally and spiritually in one place, you kind of, like, even as you're telling the stories, you've changed, which is cool. Like, you're able to look at yourself and be like, okay, I still might have the same tendency, but I'm able to catch myself now and actually start, like, allowing God to write a better story with this moment. Yeah.
So it's interesting about the story about sitting at that lunch meeting, seeing my friend speak at this conference, and feeling like I should be doing that. You know, why don't I have those opportunities? Just, you know, last weekend had the chance to be down in Indiana speaking at a youth convention, and it was one of those events that just wasn't going well. You know, like it wasn't what I hoped it was going to be. We had technical issues. The environment wasn't great. Students felt disconnected. And I found myself thinking, like, why am I here? So here I have the moment to, like, you know, Francis Chan wasn't there. There was no Francis Chan around, but, like, I was doing that thing that I wanted to do 10, 12 years ago, like, but it just wasn't working out the way that I had hoped. And I was frustrated by that. And so, you know, right before my second session, this guy who's kind of like the organizer of the event, one of the organizers, he just walked up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Hey, I just want you to know I'm praying for you. This is a Kairos moment for you." And it, like, totally caught me off guard, because I don't know too many other people who use the language of Kairos moments like we do. Now, it's not anything we invented. It's a Greek term. Lots of other people do use it, but I don't come across people often who use that term like that. So he prayed for me, and then I had to go speak, and I was like, I got to go talk to this guy. And so I found him and said, tell me about that. Tell me how you know that, or what that term means to you. And he said, this is your appointed time. It's a moment where you have the opportunity to partner with God in bringing truth to these students. So it was a very humbling moment and a Kairos moment for me, that at the end of the day, again, like, the work that I do, the work that we do, isn't about our own success. It isn't about our own, you know, recognition or whatever. It's about being faithful to what God has put in front of you, responding to it accordingly, knowing that he has something for you, even if it doesn't go the way you want, and he has something for other people who are in the midst of it, who are going to be blessed by the work that he's doing in you and through you, what does it hurt just to say yes and step in and see what happens? It's like you've got this great adventure. Like you said, a better story of your life can unfold if you're just willing to say yes to whatever God puts in front of you.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome way to kick off the podcast. Thank you so much for just sharing part of your story and letting us get to see just a little bit more about you. Personally, I mean, I know you decently well.
Yeah.
I didn't know most of those stories, and just kind of makes you a little bit more three-dimensional for me as well.
Good.
So thanks for sharing today.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I look forward to getting to have these conversations with other people in our church and hearing their stories. And our hope is that these stories, as you hear them, will get you thinking about your own story, will get you paying attention to what God's doing in your life, and that you, like it says in Psalm 107, you will have a story. It says, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. We are confident that you have a story to tell, and we look forward to hearing that story in the future.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep.
All right. See you later.